Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 10th episode of 2023. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast, and our gold sponsors, Nokia and Vetro. Today I'm here in chilly San Diego at the OFC conference. Yesterday, Wendell Weeks, the CEO of Corning, gave an amazing keynote address. And I also enjoyed hearing Jayshree Uyal, the CEO of Arista, speak about the artificial intelligence and machine learning's demand on the network, and concluding that artificial intelligence doesn't happen without fiber. I'll be moderating a panel later today on the state of fiber. Back in Washington, Gigi Sohm withdrew her name from consideration for the 5th FCC commissioner seat. With a narrow Senate Democratic majority, Senator Manchin of West Virginia articulated that he would not be supporting a confirmation, and that would have made it near impossible for her to be confirmed. So no word on how soon or who will be nominated in her place. On Thursday, we expect to see President Biden unveil his fiscal year 2024 budget. This document includes the request for funding of key agencies and programs that address broadband, FCC, RUS, and NTIA. It would also address tax issues and could request funding for programs like the Affordability Connectivity Program. Congress will need to approve the budget. Next Wednesday will be our 3rd episode of our monthly webinar series, Where's the Funding? And so if you missed our last episode with NTIB Director Evan Feynman, I highly recommend that you go to the FBI website under events and watch the replay. Next week's episode is Intro to the Capital Stack with David Harton, the president of ITC Holdings Company. This will be next Wednesday, March 15th at 11 a.m. Eastern. So you're not going to want to miss that. Speaking of not missing events, please register today for our next Regional Fiber Connect workshop and train-to-trainer class in Oklahoma City on April 6th. Our last Regional Fiber Connect workshop was sold out, and we had to turn away nearly 50 people, so please do not wait to register. We want to make sure everybody can get in. That brings us today's Fiber for Breakfast session with Jamie Linderman with industry research firm Omnia, who's going to share with us her latest research in a session titled Not Your Grandpa's Cable Company, and how today many MSOs are moving forward with fiber. But before I formally introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce Trish Ehlers from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thanks, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us today. Before I go over a few logistical items, I'd like to once again thank the platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco, and our gold sponsors, Nokia and Vetro. If you'd all keep in mind that you're just in listen mode only, to ask a question, you can type it into the question box located within your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's webinar. This presentation is being recorded and will be available to members only on FBA's website. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. If you take a minute to do that, we'd really appreciate your input. I'll pass it back to Gary now to introduce our panelists and get us started. Gary?
Thanks, Trish, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the president and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, we've heard from Michael Morey, the president and CEO of Bluebird Network, who discussed how best practices deliver top net promoter scores for Bluebird Network. It's great to see that fiber providers are helping to significantly improve the perception of the broadband industry with subscribers. Today's Fiber for Breakfast session was with Jamie Linderman with research firm Omnia to share her latest research in a session titled Not Your Grandpa's Cable Company, how today MSOs are moving forward with fiber. Jamie is a principal analyst and research manager in Omnia covering the Broadband Access Intelligence Service. Jamie's research area includes fiber, copper, cable, fixed wireless access technologies. Her reports include quarterly market share trackers, forecasts, next-gen technologies, analysis, and business strategy, along with specializing in consultation projects. Jamie has worked as a telecom analyst for over 7 years. So welcome, Jamie. And for our audience, please type in your questions as you go, and we'll work them into the Q&A at the end. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Jamie.
Thanks so much, Gary, and thanks for having me on today. So today, I'd like to talk about how MSOs are no longer going to be cable based. It's something that's been happening for a long time. A lot of cable operators would tell you they already have more fiber in their network than cable. But you know, to start, it would just be I'd like to just go over sort of some of this transformation. So how can we tell where the cable operators are going? So late 90s was really the introduction of cable broadband with the introduction of DOCSIS 1.0, which allowed IP data transmission over coax. Then we get into early 2000s, we see DOCSIS 2.0 and DOCSIS 3.0 introduced, which increased both the downstream and upstream speeds available. We get into 2013. This is the introduction of DOCSIS 3.1. This did a lot to expand capacity on the HFC network with the introduction of OFDMA, and then the concept of a distributed access architecture, which is moving the intelligence from the head-end office or hub out into the field by using fiber. Additionally, in 2017 is really where we saw the commercial launch of point-to-point active Ethernet services. These have been going on for several years, but to actually see in our market share, the commercial deployments really started about 2017. And then we get to 2019. This is the introduction of DOCSIS 4.0, which is, you know, the headlines of what the next step is for cable operators from an HFC standpoint. It introduced full duplex and extended spectrum, as well as the idea of node plus zero, which is essentially pulling fiber all the way to the node and then using no amplifiers. It's just fiber to the distribution point, essentially. And then we get into around, I'd say approximately 2020, because it really depends on the operator, but we started to see commercial PON rollouts. This was really, we've seen operators go with 2.5 gig GPON, 1 gig, 10 gig EPON, as well as 10 gig GPON. And we also saw the rollout of DAA begin with some of the larger tier 1 operators, as well as operators in Europe. We really don't see mass deployments of DOCSIS 4.0 until 2024, but essentially around the same time frame we see 25 gig commercializing, and then in 2026 we see 50 gig commercializing, and that is for both GPON and EPON. There are solutions for both, and many vendors offer the ability to do both GPON or EPON with over the same equipment. And then we look forward to the next decade, 2030. There's a lot of questions around whether DOCSIS is going to go another generation, or what's beyond 25 gig, 50 gig? Is it 100 gig? Is it 200 gig? So there's a lot of questions still being asked, but we definitely know that 25 and 50 gig PON has a lot of runway. So moving to the next slide. So how can we tell where a cable operator is going? So today I wanted to talk about a survey that we did fresh off the press. We got the final numbers last night. So we surveyed based on cable plans and fiber access network plans, and I'd like to share some of those results with you. So we surveyed around 60 cable operators or MSOs across 5 regions. 91% of the respondents were decision makers, meaning they have direct influence on their network deployment strategy. And again, this survey was conducted in late February, early March. Next slide, please. And so a majority of the respondents were from North America, around 64%. And then we had a split between 4 other regions. But really, most of the respondents were from North America. So for the purposes of today, it's a good sample size for talking about this region. Next slide, please. So taking a look at survey respondents by organizational revenue, we had a pretty decent mixture across the board of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or 4 MSOs. So it's a pretty good sampling size, and it gives us some in-depth information rather than just apply it to one type of tier. Next slide, please. So taking a look at some of the data, so 43% of MSOs have already deployed PON, in PON technology in the network. We saw this, the tiers that had already deployed really was between the largest and the smallest organizations that have already deployed PON. We really saw that the in between, the middle-sized organizations were the ones that tended to say within 12 months or 24 months or longer. We did find that smaller organizations tended to deploy more EPON and remained committed to further generations of EPON, but there is a pretty good split across the board when talking about GPON versus EPON. Next slide, please. So of those responded, 76% of respondents, of those that deployed PON, 76% of those respondents said their organization had also deployed FTTH services. We decided to use 3 years because obviously it allows us to see a sample from the start of the pandemic to now to get an understanding of where this evolution has happened. And we also see that the ones that have deployed FTTH, these are for residential services, but there's also the point, like to point out that they may be using PON for business services and additional applications like Smart City. Next slide, please. So let's talk about drivers towards using PON in the access network by MSOs. So competition is really just one factor driving. 56% of respondents stated that this was one of the top contributing factors. Secondly, 46% of respondents said new business services was a main driver for PON. 39% talked about enhanced residential services to current footprint, and this can include gaming, low latency services, as well as 35% talked about lower OpEx, really more fiber equals lower operational spend. And as well as greenfield scenarios, which is the premise of laying fiber before there's infrastructure or housing built. Next slide, please. But there are obstacles that remain. For many MSOs, they've got decades worth of investment already in the ground, and new levels of CapEx for fiber to the prem rollouts is too difficult to justify in lieu of further cable plant upgrades. Additionally, 41% of respondents said time to market. Cable is really in a different position than new fiber builds, is because they already have a subscriber base that they need to nurture in order to prevent churn. And this is really different than, say, a builder who's rolling out fiber for the first time and just building their subscriber base. Additionally, 39% of respondents said one of the top obstacles was return on investment horizon not ideal. Again, we have to think about the existing assets and opportunity for a growth in a specific time frame in order for in order to meet shareholder requirements or investor return requirements. Another point, 37% said migrating existing customers to PON was a major point. It's a lot of truck rolls, it's a lot of groundwork, and it's really that last mile that I think is preventing a lot of cable operators from pulling fiber all the way. In addition, multi-vendor interoperability. 33% of respondents said this was a main obstacle. So there are some cable MSOs that we are seeing ripping and replacing HFC with fiber, but the majority are transitioning where the best market opportunity is. To them, it's important to have partners that can help them through the transformation process, whether they use one or two vendors or several. Next slide, please. So here I wanted to take a look at some of the macro impacts and survey results. So looking at COVID-19 pandemic, I thought this was interesting because a majority said, 38% said COVID did not have an influence on their PON deployment timelines. But however, 32% said it accelerated or accelerated significantly, and 21% said it decelerated or decelerated significantly. So it sort of spread out across the board there. Competition was by far the biggest driver for accelerating or significantly accelerating PON deployment timelines. However, 32% said no influence. Supply chain, for this was about half and half, acceleration and deceleration. I think that really depends on the MSO and their access to supplies as well as all the parts that they need. And then additionally, vendor solutions. They mostly had a significant impact on driving those plans forward, 46%. New types of vendor solutions are definitely having an effect on their timelines and if they're making it easier to transition to fiber. Next slide, please. So some of the top 3 influences on vendor selection. I would argue that we would get similar results if we were polling fiber only operators. However, really the top one was pricing competitiveness. Secondly was multi-vendor interoperability, which we mentioned was one of the largest obstacles as well. And then end-to-end solutions. This really changed whether you're a larger tier MSO or a smaller tier MSO, but a larger amount of the smaller MSOs wanted an end-to-end solution. And this includes all the way from the head end or central office to the home and within the home as well. Next slide, please. And then this here was a poll question we had on when will your organization sunset its HFC DOCSIS broadband services? 3% had said they've already sunset, and 77% total said they will sunset HFC broadband services within the next 10 years. Now, the larger the operator, the more likely they were to say no plan to sunset their HFC DOCSIS plans, and so I think those are the ones that we're going to see move forward with DOCSIS 4.0 in some size. So what does this mean for market and vendor growth? Next slide, please. So this is our cable this is our cable broadband access equipment forecast. This covers revenue for the global cable broadband access equipment market. Equipment covered in this forecast is CMTS CCAP data ports, and which are really the equipment that's in the head end or the central office, as well as the movement towards virtual CMTS or cloud-based CMTS, as well as some DAA equipment, including remote PHY, remote MAC-PHY devices, as well as digital nodes. While this market forecast shows that there will be a growth in consumption of cable access equipment over the decade, it starts to wane into the next decade as cable operators invest more fiber to the premise. For this forecast, we see that it will continue to grow at a CAGR of 2.1% through 2028. Next slide, please. However, on the other hand, we're going to see in just the next couple years, North America become #1 in share for PON equipment consumption. This is exceeding China and every other region in our forecast. This shows that fiber penetration is ticking away in the US and Canada, and by 2028, we will far exceed every other region. We expect an overall CAGR globally of 11.5% through 2028. In North America alone, we expect a CAGR of 25.6%. So there's definitely a lot a lot of runway and a lot of action that we're going to see over the next few years. But one thing I would like to just pose here is that there are 80 million homes on HFC-based connection at this time. The majority which is the majority of subscribers are currently on a cable modem. So this is good news for vendors that offer paths for cable operator MSOs, because it's going to take many years to migrate those 80 million subscribers. But as we saw with some of the macro factors, timelines for MSOs are accelerating based on supply chains, vendor solutions, and of course, competition factors. And next slide, please. And with that, if you'd like any more information on our survey, please feel free to reach out. This is just a sampling of it. Gary, I've reached there. Just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to present some data, and I thank the audience for your time.
Well, we got a bunch of questions here, Jamie. So this is really interesting, especially seeing, first of all, the one, I guess the headline is that the cable industry is going to sunset cable network in the next 10 years. That's basically the takeaway. Is that right?
A majority, a big portion of cable operators will. I wouldn't say it's completely sunsetting, but I would say the majority of new builds will stop.
Well, I think there's probably still a few T1s out in the network, and some things never die.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, so I mean, what it looked like from your chart is the tipping point is 2025 is when we start to see the declining market after that, right? So in the next basically 2 years then we're going to be heading downhill on, as people move more aggressively to PON.
Yeah, really the takeaway from the forecast is that cable operators are responding now to the forthcoming fiber competition. So they need to be prepared now, and they're working towards that in order to be as competitive as they can. In some regards, that involves fiber to the home.
So we've had other analysts, cable analysts on that said basically what they're seeing is cable operators will deploy fiber in all greenfield, they'll deploy fiber in competitive areas, and then in areas where there's no competition, they will continue to roll out their duct tape of DOCSIS and keep that kind of resuscitating that network. Is that your understanding?
I would say that's a pretty good broad assumption. I would also state there are some extremely dense areas that are just too difficult to roll out DOCSIS 4.0 or to roll out fiber to the home. And these are special use cases where, take a place like Boston, for example, which is it's old, it's dense, it's hard to run fiber in some regards. Places like that will continue to be upgraded on HFC to DOCSIS 4.0. But the question is how long will DOCSIS 4.0 be feasible enough before fiber to the home should be run? I mean, and that could be 10, 15 years, or the ones that have no plans to sunset, they could continue to run those that generation of DOCSIS.
So when we saw the administration come out with their planning for the infrastructure funding, and they want to do 100 by 100, and the cable industry was up in arms and pushed down to upstream to 20 meg as the standard for 100 by 20. So if you look at the DOCSIS standards, they should be able to do that. But my understanding is that the upstream's not being deployed. That it's too expensive to upgrade to to be able to get the higher bandwidths. What do you think?
We see numbers across the board of costs to roll out fiber to the prem, cost to pass homes. I think we're still a bit in a wait and see on the symmetrical side. There is an organizational culture around cable that the average consumer doesn't require a certain amount of upstream. So unless there's a certain area or a certain target demographic or market that requires symmetrical, they're going to keep it asymmetrical where they can.
So I don't know if you can answer this, but what are the economic advantages of deploying PON from a cable remote node versus direct from the cable hub? Is it the point of PON to have a passive network? I guess that's the question. So is,
Uh-huh.
go
I
ahead.
would say what the ability to have, I assume they're talking about remote OLTs, is the ability to roll out to more rural places, but be able to offer higher speeds and larger capacity if they're rolling that OLT out into a cabinet. Having to run it from the central office all the way, it's going to cause too much degradation. And I think it opens opportunities to use those remote OLTs to places that there isn't necessarily the opportunity or the business case to roll out a full hub central office. And it allows for further market grab in order without spending the money on a central office.
Jamie, do you have a feel for how much DOCSIS 3.0 versus 3.1 is in the network? And I guess we're not really seeing 4.0 until next year, right?
Correct. In our survey, respondents, 50% said they had rolled out DOCSIS 3.1. It was actually probably closer to 46% had rolled out DOCSIS 3.1. And, there's a lot of conversation about DOCSIS 3.1 still having a lot of runway. I mean, the spectrum increases up to 1.8 gigahertz. There's a lot of opportunity to continue to run DOCSIS 3.1 or roll it out. We've seen a lot of DOCSIS 3.1 rolled out by larger tier operators, but there are plenty of DOCSIS 3.0 rollouts that still exist that have not yet upgraded to DOCSIS 3.1.
So why would anybody do node plus zero? I mean, if you're going to do node plus zero, why wouldn't you just go ahead and do PON?
I think the driver behind that is you're pulling fiber to the closest distribution point, but you're mitigating the cost of rolling fiber into the home. That I would argue is probably the biggest obstacle that they're able to overcome with node plus zero.
And one of the questions came in is, what are your thoughts on what is the normal speed to the home standard in the next 2 years?
The next 2 years, well, I don't have a crystal ball, but we know that 1 gig is the norm these days. And whether, you can have the conversation on whether a subscriber needs 1 gig, but really it comes down to marketing. If they think they want 1 gig and they can pay for 1 gig, it shows that the operator is high quality, has invested in their network, and they're more likely to have less churn as well. I think in the next 2 years, I mean, we've already started to see 5 gig offerings and 10 gig offerings from fiber operators in the US. I think we're going to continue to climb for MSO offerings, especially as they roll out new fiber services. They're going to want to continue to compete. Whether they'll roll out symmetrical services on a widespread scale is to be determined.
So one of the things you said, drivers, that wasn't in your survey, is, I see a lot of cable companies doing very well in a lot of the grant programs. So like Charter won, a lot of money in RDOF, and we've seen at the state, broadband grants that a lot of cable operators are winning, deploying fiber. Is winning government subsidies a big driver for cable operators?
I think it's a big driver for anybody, but definitely cable operators to continue to connect those places where the last mile business case has been too difficult. I think that we'll continue to see wins with cable operators, and I think they're trying to remain competitive as they can, because there's a lot of forthcoming fiber. As you know, there's a lot of forthcoming fiber operators out there that consist of rural co-ops, electric utilities. I mean, there's a lot of competition coming their way, and so I think they're going to use anything they can to their advantage to continue to build out.
Well, we saw it with telcos a half decade ago, where they all changed from a telco to becoming a broadband ISP. At what point do the cable industry no longer use the cable term? I mean, I would think they would have already started to just distance themselves from that. image.
I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. What would we call a cable operator who's got both fiber PON assets as well as cable assets? Because I've heard many say, well, we have more fiber at our plant than we do HFC, so we're sort of technically not a cable operator anymore. And I think the term MSO will continue, but I think it will be within the next 10 years. I mean, as they sunset services, we're going to have to figure out the other thing is talking about content, video content. There's a lot of operators that I've heard that are no longer trying to keep churn down with video content. They said that the content's too high and there's really no profit there for them. So I think the real question is it going to be similar to telcos where they don't offer phone service anymore? I mean, they do have voice over IP, but your traditional landline services are no longer existent for the most part. Is that going to be the same with cable, because everything's just streaming over the top now?
Well, I guess some people like the legacy, when SVC acquired Bell South and renamed themselves American Telephone and Telegraph, it seems crazy.
Right.
But, all right. Well, listen, Jamie, this is awesome stuff. I really appreciate you sharing your latest research. So thank you so much. I really appreciate everything you do for our industry. And I want to thank the audience for joining us today. And I hope we can get back together next Wednesday. We're going to be discussing the Treasury Department multi-billion-dollar investment in broadband with Joey Winder, the director of the Capital Projects Fund, that $10 billion broadband fund at the U.S. Department of Treasury. And he's going to tell us how Treasuries work on as part of the Biden administration's efforts to achieve the goal of deploying high-speed internet to those without access and lowering the cost for those who cannot afford it. So you're not going to want to miss that. We'll see you guys again next Wednesday. And thanks, Jamie. Stay warm there in Montana.
Thank you so much. Have a good time in San Diego.
All right, bye all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.